Good evening, New York City, and thank you for joining us tonight as we celebrate and commemorate the 5th anniversary of the passing of a Fair Chance Act. My name is Solomon Acevedo. I am a community organizer here at the Office of the Public Advocate. My pronouns are he, his, and I'm happy for all of you to join us this evening to listen to what will be a powerful conversation. And now I will introduce the Public Advocate of New York City, Jumaane D. Williams.
Thank you so much, Solomon. Peace and blessings to everybody, to our panelists, to my staff, to folks who are watching. We're here to discuss the Fair Chance Act and some other things that are left to be done on this anniversary of the Fair Chance Act passing. It was enacted in 2015, 5 years ago, to protect New Yorkers with a convicted record being subjected to discrimination. There was a lot of pushback, and as usual with things like this, the world was going to crumble if we passed this, but it didn't, and it helped a lot of people. And now if an employer rescinds a job offer based off an applicant's criminal history, the employer must provide a written explanation of the decision alongside a copy of the applicant's record. The legislation has decreased employment discrimination, created new opportunities for those who have criminal records. The law is working really well to hold employers accountable. We didn't want to necessarily force anybody to hire any one person. We want to make sure that everybody had equity in being looked at and not being, their resume being sent to the circular file because there were justice involved. In 2020, just this year, 7 cases settled by the New York City Commission of Human Rights yielded over $119,000 in civil penalties alone. That doesn't count damages. A 2019 settlement with Montefiore Medical Center, who refused to rehire a person based on a prior conviction. They agreed to pay over $100,000 in back pay, including overtime, $35,000 in emotional distress, $50,000 in civil penalties to the city. From 2016 to 2020, just 35 cases were settled by the NYCCHR and resulted in over almost $400,000 in civil penalties to the city. We got to remember some cases may not even result in civil penalties that are paid out. For those same 35 cases over the same period, almost $1 million, $800,000 in damages, back pay, miscellaneous fees have been paid out. And in some cases, employees also agreed to take trainings to ensure the Fair Chance Act is followed. That is exciting to know that this law is working. And even more, all the things that we heard were going to happen did not happen. And hopefully what we've seen are people given access to the employment that they need. But we still have to go further. And so we have a Fair Chance Act 2.0, intro number 1314 right now in the City Council. We're hoping will get passed soon. It closes some loopholes that exist. People with unsealed violations or pending criminal case are still subject to employment, even though it's just pending, while those with a settled case are not. A New York Penal Law 240.37, also called Walking While Trans Law, is a prime example of a state offense that is unsealed and is heavily discriminates against trans women particularly of more color and immigrants. And so we're going to continue to talk about what needs to be done, what we got accomplished. And I'm excited because I had a legislative director at the time when the Fair Chance Act was implemented. He now happens to be the first deputy of the public advocate public advocate's office, who will be leading the discussion today. And I'm also excited because I had a co-conspirator on the city council to help get this done. She is now the borough president of Manhattan and has always been a great leader on these issues. And I have to say that it's long before, a lot of people are talking about this stuff now, but Borough President Brewer has been talking about it for a long time when the political winds weren't in the direction they are now. So I'm gonna pass it off to my colleague in government, and then we're gonna start a discussion. So peace and blessings to everyone. Love and light to you all.
Thank you very much, Jumaane Williams, public advocate. I'm a big fan of yours. And I remember with Nick Smith sitting in all those rooms at 250 Broadway when there were no windows, and we negotiated this, and people thought the sky was gonna fall, and it didn't. And so it's really good to know that it has made a difference in people's lives. We have work to do, but it's better because of it. And I want to thank Reyes-Scales because she too was at every press conference and telling her story, and it made a difference. And we also had Legal Aid Society and Vocal NY and many others who will not forget that this was a struggle, but it passed. And I think, I remember in 2011, before we actually got it passed, I think that then Mayor Bloomberg had done something similar for city agencies, but we made it for everybody. And that's made a big difference. So it's 5 years is a long time, but I have to say, because of pandemic and maybe, I don't know, at least 14%, I'm sure it's higher actually, the unemployment in the city of New York, this act is needed more than ever because people are hard to get a job. I think there are about 2,500 folks coming from Rikers who were released just in June 2020 because of COVID. And so they, as an example, would be people who could take advantage of it. And then, of course, the State Department of Correction and Community Supervision reported in June that 898 people had come from the state facilities. Every single one of these is eligible for this act. And I also want to say that the good news is when New York does something, other jurisdictions do the same. And so, but there aren't a lot. About 20 localities and 14 states have banned the box in public and private sector hiring. So New York was ahead because it has been done more recently. 21 states did what Mayor Bloomberg did, which is just ban it for the government, but not for the public. And for me, to be honest with you, the public is even more important. So it's one of the strongest acts in the country, and I hope that you pass something else in the city council that can make it even stronger. I want to say during this whole discussion, as you know, the issue was how will enforcement go? Because enforcement is the key. Without that, you do not have a law that means anything. And I want to thank the New York City Commission on Human Rights' Law Enforcement Bureau. You mentioned some of the dollars that have been obtained, but I have to say they have reached settlements with cases against 8 non-compliant employers who had to adjust their hiring practices and, as you said, award damages. Settlements have ranged from $2,500 in recognition of emotional distress caused by non-compliance, all the way up to $65,000, and you mentioned even larger numbers in damages and attorney's fees after a person has been denied. And I have to say something else very interesting. I don't know if it was Marilyn or somebody else, but right after the act passed and went into effect, we were thinking, you file, you go to get a job, you fill out the paper. I always said in the past, it would be one pile for those who had a record and one who didn't. And of course, which pile would get hired. But then, of course, we forgot online. So when we first passed the law and it went into effect, I was getting complaints that employers who posted online were not doing the right thing. They did not have the application correct in terms of what it should say. So that was corrected. So all of this took time to get right. But there is no question that no one should be penalized for an offense irrelevant to their job application. And it's only fair that employers who unlawfully penalize job applicants for their criminal history are themselves penalized. I feel very strongly about that. So we're very, very proud of that. There's a lot more to do. And I think that once you get through the hiring process, that there's, the skills and qualification to catch the manager's eyes, because as you know, once you get the job offer, that's when the person can say, I have a record, but not until then, under any circumstance whatsoever. We are working now with groups at 2 developments in Harlem, Grant and Manhattanville. And there's a grant that's been awarded to be able to work with 103 families who have somebody returning, probably from the state facilities. And this grant has a community advisory board and lots of support that goes with it. And it'll be interesting to see, working with this particular situation, whether in fact this law comes into play and whether or not there will be any incorrect ways that it is being enforced in terms of the individuals. And of course, we keep in touch with the Fortune Society, and they've been very pleased. I have to say the person who's been most pleased are the folks who participate with anybody going into retail. the Retail Wholesale Union, which you know very well, Stuart Applebaum, was a big supporter at the very beginning, to his credit. And he has told me specifically that those who are in retail, which is a job that many people can get pre-pandemic, I will say, that this law has been very helpful. Just to give an example. So in talking, as you did, to the Commission on Human Rights, just to give an example, there was, I'm not going to give all the examples, obviously, but some of the agencies that do employment that hire nannies, they had to pay. Something called errands had to pay. New York City Fire Services and Guards had to pay. The Alliance Building Services had to pay. The New York Institute of Technology, Crunch Fitness had to pay. And these are all good cases that the commission worked on. SWAT had to pay. And something called In Dinero. So what I'm trying to say is it's across the board. There's not one industry. And the good news about such a list is that people are applying for all different kinds of jobs, and they're getting them because the law is in effect. And you know darn well that this law wasn't there, all of those and other ones that you mentioned, people would not be getting the job. So it's always a pleasure to work with you, public advocate Damani Williams, but I have to say, in many years, this is perhaps this and open data that couldn't be more opposite, and paid sick leave. Those are three bills that I feel very proud of. This one came across as borough president, which is even more special. So congratulations to everyone who made it possible, and I look forward to the panel. And thank you, Nick Smith.
Thank you. Thank you, public advocate. Thank you, borough president. It's been 5 years of tremendous work, and we've seen the positive effects of this law. So we want to again thank my principal, the public advocate, and you, Gail, for your continued commitment to fair chance, and also just equity just around the city for folks from all kinds of backgrounds, including folks who have a record. So again, thanks to our public advocate and our president. I'm Nick Smith, a first deputy public advocate, as mentioned, and I'm thrilled to be here. My role here is to moderate, so I'm going to introduce the panel that we have here for discussion, and then we'll allow them to make opening remarks. So why don't we jump right into the introduction of the panelists. So Marilyn Reyes-Scales, who was with us back in 2015, helping to organize on this law. She is a harm reduction advocate at the Peer Network of New York. Thank you for jumping on, Marilyn. Next, Brandon Holmes, the co-director of the Freedom Agenda. And Brandon will help ground the conversation in terms of what organizing looks like when it comes to fair chance and other organizing when it comes to justice involved folks who have a record. We want to thank Melissa Ader, staff attorney at the Legal Aid Society, who will give us the in and outs of what the law says, what it does, and what it looks like. And then in terms of enforcement, we want to welcome Franck Joseph from the Commission on Human Rights, just in terms of going through what enforcement looks like, some stats on what they're seeing, if there are any particular industries that violate the law, what the fines look like, that kind of thing. So we want to thank Franck for joining us from the commission. Yonah Zeitz from the KATAL Center from Equity, Health, and Justice. He is the policy coordinator at the KATAL Center. We thank him for joining. He'll go into people on talking about people on parole and how they're impacted by the law and other related topics. And of course, from our partner, Vocal New York, last but not least, one of our partners when we got the law done was Vocal New York, who was with us setting up those press conferences, bringing in advocates and really helping us to get this bill across the line. From Vocal New York, we have John McFarlane, and John's going to speak to the reality that civil rights for employment and housing extend to more than just budgets. It goes into community reinvestment. So thank you all for joining. That is a powerful panel, and I'm going to ask Melissa to let's get into the first question as a reminder of literally what the Fair Chance Act 1.0 is, what it says, and then we'll go from there. So Melissa, you want to jump on and give your opening remarks?
Absolutely. Thank you so much to the public advocate and to the borough president and to everybody on this panel today. I am Melissa Ader. I'm a staff attorney at the Worker Justice Project at Legal Aid, and we help people who have criminal records and are unlawfully denied employment because of their conviction record or their arrest record. The Fair Chance Act, which went into effect 5 years ago, has been a game changer for my clients and for the people in this city. The nuts and bolts of the law are, first, it prohibits most employers from asking about arrest or conviction records until after the employer makes a conditional job offer. And the reason why that is so important, that delay into the background check process, is because employers are forced to see applicants as human beings and not as check boxes, not as their conviction records. That has been enormously important to New Yorkers. Now, after the employer likes the applicant, decides to make a conditional job offer, the employer is allowed to ask about the person's conviction record in certain ways. But if the employer sees the conviction record and is concerned about it, they are not allowed to simply withdraw the job offer. Instead, what has to happen is the employer must do an 8-factor analysis where it considers, is there a direct relationship between the job and the conviction record? Is there an unreasonable risk that the applicant poses to the company? And the employer has to consider 8 factors, including how long ago the offense occurred, the person's evidence of rehabilitation and good conduct, how serious the offense is, etc. After the employer does that analysis, if the employer is really seriously considering withdrawing the job offer, they have to give the applicant something called a Fair Chance Act notice, which goes into the individualized analysis of the person's record and its relationship to the job duties. Then, and this is to me the most important part of the law, the applicant gets a chance to respond to the employer. The applicant gets a reasonable period of time of at least 3 business days. And they can say to the employer, you know, I see that you're worried about my grand larceny conviction. Let me tell you why you shouldn't be worried. Here's what I've done with my life since that offense. I've been working, or I've been volunteering, or I've been caring for my kids. And it's that response that the employers really need to take a look at and say, okay, we're not going to look at you as a conviction. We're going to look at you as a whole person. And oftentimes we see that the employers respond to that positively and they decide, okay, we're not going to withdraw the job offer. We will hire you, and that's wonderful for our clients and for New Yorkers in general. But if the employer withdraws the job offer and does so in an unlawful way, then the applicant can go to the City Commission on Human Rights for enforcement, or the applicant can sue the employer. So it's really been a game-changing law. And you know, there are a couple of other important steps to take that the Fair Chance Act 2.0 would fix, like extending the Fair Chance Act to pending criminal cases and unsealed violations and new convictions. But ultimately, this law has been really just an enormous benefit to the people of New York.
That's great. Thank you. And pardon me for mispronouncing your last name, Melissa. That was a really great introduction about literally what the law does. And I do want to just mention, yeah, we do have a Fair Chance Act 2.0 bill pending, which does, as Melissa talked about, shield from disclosure pending cases. So if you have a ACD, that's adjournment in contemplation of dismissal, or a violation of those things, once this second version passes, will be shielded from disclosure in the same way that other convictions would be shielded, or convictions themselves would be shielded. And so we're calling the council to pass that bill. It is has been heard, and we're just calling on it to be voted out. We're hearing it should be voted out fairly soon. We don't have a date, but everyone should stay tuned for that bill. We will keep folks informed. Before we go to Marilyn, I just want to talk about the racial element of all of this as far as where we are today. You know, the justice system is one that, as we all know, has real racial disparities just across the entire system, from the initial interactions with police all the way to the possible conviction stage. And it's our responsibility as folks in government to make sure that we piece by piece dismantle a system that particularly disadvantages Black and brown people, which it has done, the system has done for the beginning of time. And as I saw it 5 years ago, and I continue to see it, ban the box of fair chance is but one of many needed steps. And, you know, further along in the conversation, we'll get to other areas that we need to really push on to reduce further collateral consequences of a record. But this really is an issue of racial justice. No longer can we accept a society where we allow discrimination in our justice system. It never was acceptable, but I think we're at a point now where we're taking real concrete steps where we can to dismantle those systems and employment. And I'll tell you, in terms of employment, we get a lot of pushback from the employment sector, basically saying they want authority to hire and fire who they want. Folks who have a record may be a threat. You know what? Quite frankly, our starting point as human beings are humans first. And sometimes folks make mistakes, and sometimes folks don't. There are many people, if you look at the Innocence Project, there are many people who serve time in jail or prison who are innocent of the charges they are convicted on. And 7 times out of 10, those folks are Black or brown. So that is real. That is an issue of racial justice. And I want to bring in Marilyn, who was with us in 2015, who helped us get this across the finish line. Marilyn, why don't you jump on and let us know your thoughts on this 5-year anniversary?
I mean, it's an honor to be here, and this has been a total game changer in my life, because for so long I fought to try to find a job since 1997, since I came home, and it took me until this bill was passed for me to be able to get a full-time job. At 52 years old, I never had a full-time job as a grown woman all my life, and after this passed into law, I was able to get my first full-time job. Think about that. Middle-aged woman getting her first full-time job because of first of all, I got felonies. Second of all, I'm a drug user, or was a drug user. So then with 2 strikes against me for me being able to get employment. And since the Fair Chance Act passed into law, I've been able to get 1 job. Then now I was able to get a second job with more pay. I work for the city of New York, something I could never imagine. I have health insurance. I'm able to support my child. Like it changed my life totally. And it gave me hope again when I had no hope, because, coming from drug use, coming from prison, all you see is stigma and judgment. No one wants to give you a fair chance. And this with the Fair Chance Act, it gives me a fair chance at getting a job that I qualify for. And my whole life has changed. And I think, adding an amendment to it and opening the door for more other people to get jobs, because without you being able to support yourself, how can you pay rent? How can you buy food? Sometimes people go back to certain things that they've done in their life because they have no choice, because they're not given opportunities. And we need opportunities and resources for people coming home from prison. And people that are former drug users, people can work. People can do things, even if it's starting off little, but at least they can work. And I think this is a great thing. For me, still the challenge I still haven't been able to get housing. And that's a big deal for me, because, I have a job, but always find it hard to get housing. And I never get approved for apartments. So, like, how am I supposed to, what am I supposed to do? Like, we need to work on that too.
I completely agree with you, Marilyn. First, I just want to say, every time I hear your story, and folks should know, Marilyn is a minor celebrity, if I can call you that. Her story's been covered on NBC News and a couple of big outlets, because, I mean, think about what she said. 52 years old, first full-time job, post Fair Chance Act 1.0 that we're calling it now. That's why we do this work. And as I mentioned earlier, it's piece by piece, day by day, pushing towards progress where we can. And so, Marilyn, I am, on behalf of the PA, and I know Gail's proud of you. I hear you when you talked about the housing issue. Let's absolutely talk about that. We want to help solve that issue. And I know we're going to talk fair chance in housing once we get past the discussion of the Fair Chance Act. But you to be commended because you stepped out at a time where it wasn't easy to, tell your story and be that vulnerable. So for, 5 years of your advocacy, thank you so much, Marilyn. And I'm so glad you were able to join us on the panel tonight. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. Okay, let's bring on Brandon Holmes from the Freedom Agenda. I know I've known Brandon several organizing roles. I'm happy to announce that he's co-director of the Freedom Agenda. Brandon, why don't you jump on and give us your opening?
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, one thing that I want to kind of build my opening around is something that Melissa had said, which I think is the single most crucial piece of any fair chance legislation, whether it be fair chance hiring or fair chance housing. We're forcing employers to look at you as a whole person, right? Not as a criminal record or as a checked box. And in my experience, 1 year after the murder of Michael Brown, I found myself organizing at Vocal with Marilyn and other folks. And 5 years later, even working in various organizing roles, we see the same narrative where we saw in the media, people were questioning day one. Well, on security footage, we saw Michael Brown may be guilty of stealing a pack of cigars. And that's possibly why he had police confrontation and why he was gunned down in the middle of the street in broad daylight. And it was used to justify, why his life was taken, right? So I think we saw the same thing play out this year with Breonna Taylor's murder and with George Floyd, right? That George's execution was justified because he forged a check, and Breonna's murder was justified because she formerly loved someone who was suspected of a crime. And this is how we see the law and the legal system is routinely determining the value of individuals' lives or what they're worth, what they can contribute to our society based on what may have been the single worst moment or day in their life or their affiliation with other people. And the idea that, right, prison or incarceration is about rehabilitation and second chances is rarely ever upheld by the law, right? So reforms like this are crucial to make sure that when people return home, they're not facing so many collateral consequences of something that they've already paid their debt for, right? That they have equal opportunities and fair chances that so many other people without criminal records have, and making sure that the systems that operate are not reinforcing discrimination or bias or hate. So yeah, any part of fair chance legislation has to center the fact that we are looking at people as a whole person and an individual with all of their lived experience and personal history, and not just checking off a box to decide who is worthy and who is unworthy.
Brilliant grounding, Brandon. Thank you so much for that. That's really a fantastic point. I tried to iterate, but you said it even better than me. We all are human beings, and that's where it begins and ends. We're not a box. We're not any mistakes, or we're not any allegations. We are human beings, and so thank you so much for that framing, Brandon. Let's shift to quickly the topic of enforcement, and I want to bring in my friend Franck Joseph, who's Deputy Commissioner at the city's Human Rights Commission, the entity charged with enforcing the law. Franck, why don't you go ahead and jump in? Yeah.
Thank you so very much, Nick, and thank you to Public Advocate Williams, Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer, and the distinguished panelists who are all here. Marilyn, I just want to say thank you so very much for sharing your story. I know that it takes a lot of courage to stand and to speak to people that you don't know, and we know that in your story, there is also freedom there because people can hear what you went through and the way that you advocated while going through it, not just for yourself, but for so many New Yorkers. The Fair Chance Act is a piece of legislation that is near and dear to me for a number of reasons. So when the Fair Chance Act was passed on October 27th, 2015, I actually was working for the council. I was chief of staff for Council Member Richards at the time. And who would know that, years later, I would be on this side, working for the agency that enforces the Fair Chance Act, and when I think about that, I think that, to be bold when as the public advocate and the Manhattan Borough President was speaking, because so many people tried to, fairmonger and say, this is what's gonna happen if this piece of legislation is passed. But in order to be bold, you need leadership, right? It's about leadership. And I think that's what we have seen. We have seen leadership from, some of our elected officials. We have seen leadership from some of our advocates. We have seen leadership from people who this legislation impacted, right? Before it was written to law, they stood up and said, no, there is a better way to do things. And so for us at the commission, while we have the privilege of enforcing this piece of legislation that ensures that employers are looking at people based on their merit and not based on possible mistakes, we thank those who really fought to ensure that this law could be codified. So I'm going to tell you a little about the New York City Commission on Human Rights. We are a civil law enforcement agency, and we are charged with upholding the city's human rights law, which is an anti-discrimination law, which basically says you cannot be treated less well because of who you are, how you identify, and your lived experiences. And it's important that we say this because we frame it this way, because when we look at other jurisdictions that have a human rights law or a civil rights law, ours is one of the most expansive, and it's read very broadly. And so in our agency, there are many teams that really make sure that things, go. There's a team that I am charged with leading, the Community Relations Bureau, which I'll talk about a little later. But we have our policy team, which this is the team that is oftentimes working with electeds and advocates when there is legislation that is under consideration to see how it will be enforced, the impact it has on the agency, the way the agency can support that and can ensure that justice is done. We also have our Law Enforcement Bureau, which is where most of our attorneys are housed, and that people, when folks want to file a complaint, you would go to our Law Enforcement Bureau. Once you go to them, you will sit with an attorney. The attorney will take as much information as possible, and if there's probable cause, then we move forward in the matter and ensuring that whatever act of discrimination that took place, that we can ensure that justice is served and that things are litigated. I want to tell folks that, when someone comes to us, why would you come to us? Like, what are the ramifications? Because it's true, right? Why am I coming to government? And bad actors, right? So if we're talking about the Fair Chance Act, an employer, a potential employer who discriminates against somebody because of the fact that, they have an arrest or conviction record, and they ask that at the job interview, it's on a job application, it's advertised when they're talking about the job. Those things, any bad actor could face up to $250,000 in civil fines and penalties. Now, each case is different, so those amounts vary, but there's also emotional distress, there's back pay, because sometimes a person is in employment and then the employer finds out about an arrest or conviction record that happened, let's say, prior to their employment, but now they're finding out, right? And so there's emotional distress, there's back pay, and so many different things that we can do. Then the Community Relations Bureau, we are charged with educating New Yorkers on their rights. We have a deck of curricula, including the Fair Chance Act, where we go into communities, we go into different spaces, and we make sure that people have a fine understanding of what their rights are, how to defend themselves so that they, are not subjected to someone treating them less well. We also work on different programs and events where we will have panel discussions such as this one. We'll have different educational forums. We'll work with community advocates and CBOs to put together forums. And we also work on and support a number of initiatives that the agency is pushing forward. This piece of legislation is so important for us. We have a lead advisor for reentry. So those who are reentering, because they, were arrested, they spent some time, and now they're reacclimating themselves to the larger society. We have a lead advisor who works with that population to ensure that folks understand what their rights are. So we're putting resources, not just the casework that we're doing, not just the educational work that we're doing, but we have people who are charged with working individually with folks specifically on this matter. We work with back to work programs. We respond to letters from folks who are coming from up north and are not sure, hey, when I come to New York City, I'm not sure what opportunities are there for me. I'm not sure if I'm going to, what can I do? We hear all of these stories, and we are ensuring that we're speaking to folks all the time. Our history, because Nick mentioned this,
this is not just about talking about arrest and conviction record, but this disproportionately impacts communities of color, particularly Black folks, right? The history of the commission is rooted in racial justice. The commission was founded after the Harlem race riots, where a Black person was allegedly killed by officers, and there were riots across the city, uproar, people were upset, and folks went to the street to demonstrate and to protest. And the mayor at the time said, we need a commission, a committee that will come together to foster intergroup relations, to ensure that people of color are not treated less well. Where are the areas where people of color are being disproportionately impacted? And through time, that committee became the Commission on Human Rights, the city agency you see today. And so when we're doing our work and we're protecting New Yorkers, our jurisdictions are in employment. We're in housing, if you're being treated less well than in housing, in public spaces. So think about that taxi cab or the park, or when you go to the store, and because you may look like myself, someone begins to follow you, right? Those are the areas where we enforce. There are also two other little known areas, one being bias-based profiling by law enforcement, and also the other being discriminatory harassment, because usually there is some type of relationship between individuals, right? Landlord to tenant, employer to employee, but discriminatory harassment could be two people walking down the street. So think of that woman who is in Grand Central Terminal, going up the escalator, and she has her hijab on, and someone says some anti-Muslim slur and pulls off her hijab. That's something that we can also, someone can come to us about as well. I talk about this because even though we're talking about the Fair Chance Act, the reality of it is we all have multiple identities, and there's intersectionality. Your issue may not be the Fair Chance Act. Maybe you understand your rights in this area and the commission has been able to assist you, but there may be other areas where you or someone would like some assistance. We're here to assist you. When we look at our numbers, from when the Fair Chance Act was enacted on October 27, 2015, up till now, present day, or I'll say the end of the fiscal year, we look at things through a fiscal year. So up till June 30th of this year, 2020, we've had over 550 cases, claims come to us that are based on conviction or arrest records. And many of them vary from the one when you're talking about the nanny service where there was $2,500 of civil fines and penalties, or you are talking about the security company where there was $40,000 or $65,000. So it definitely varies, but if you have a concern, we're asking that you come and speak to us. There's so much more for us to talk about, and I know our panelists will say a lot, but please contact the commission. We're on social media at NYCCHR. You can also Google Commission on Human Rights. You can also call us at 212-416-0196, and someone will be in touch with you. And I look forward to continuing the conversation. Thank you so very much for having us today on this panel.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you. That was really fantastic. And I think Frank's getting at a couple of points. One, it's important to be aware of the resources available to you. And the commission is a fantastic one. I can't praise the leadership enough. I know my friends at City Hall will be shocked to hear me praise a mayoral entity, but it's true, because the commission has been front and center at protecting people's rights across the city and making sure that they're aware of those rights. For example, when this law passed, it was the commission that put a bunch of money into publicizing this law. Some of you may recall there were ads on buses, subways, etc., saying criminal record, you can work with that. That was the work of the commission, and Frank, and we do thank you for working with us to want to get the law passed, publicize it, and of course now as you're doing, enforcing it and bringing about awareness. So thank you again, Frank. Let's go to John with John McFarlane, Local New York. John, you have the floor for your opening.
Thank you, my brother. Thank you for everyone tuning in. My comrades on the call with me. I'd like to start a little bit just to backtrack for those who came in a little late about the Fair Chance Act. So, I just want to summarize a bit and say that the Fair Chance Act is designed to support the most marginalized in our community. So, you know, to fully understand the law, you have to have what I would call a public campaign. It really, in my opinion, it really wasn't a public campaign to introduce the law. The law kind of just came in, and then we all kind of accepted it as the status quo. In the civil rights and the housing context, you know, I think that because housing is a civil right and people can't stay home, there's never been a robust public awareness campaign. So I think that would serve to educate the most impacted that, you know, have seen violations of this act occur over and over again. When I say like public awareness, I mean, you know, programs that would make folks that are most vulnerable to the act understand their rights and their remedies under the act. That's why we at Vocal, you know, we try to employ strategies that make awareness as a prominent factor in the work that we do. We think that awareness is what most people are. When you're aware, you're prepared. You understand? And when you're prepared, it's harder for people to violate your rights. The Fair Chance Act, and I know most people understand this, obligates prospective employers to extend an offer of employment before any like analysis of an individual's criminal record can be undertaken. So, you know, if the nature of the conviction would not bear a negative impact on the work that you're being offered, then they can't discriminate against you. You know, they can't fail to offer you some employment. But here's the rub, and I think that this is like the quintessential moment when it comes to the Fair Chance Act. A lot of these corporations employ lawyers, you know, expensive counselors, overpaid HR departments. So a lot of the times there are ways to circumvent the Fair Chance Act, right? And you know, I'm not saying all employers will take the opportunity to disadvantage reentry folks and folks that are impacted by it. But you know, in New York City, some will do that. Even with the passing of bail reform and the subsequent rollbacks, I feel like the Fair Chance Act right now is more relevant than ever over the last 5 years. So, you know, many people are being released pre-trial. We all know that, and more coming home on probation, parole, and some COVID-19 releases have taken place. But I think there should be a visibility index required for employment agencies. I walk into the workforce one in Queens County where I live. I don't see any reader material on the Fair Chance Act. Okay, I don't see a brochure, I don't see a pamphlet, I don't see a fact sheet, I don't see any talking points, nothing about the Fair Chance Act. So how are people most impacted supposed to be aware of a law that is on the books for the last 5 years that could help them procure employment without being discriminated against? So that's part of the problem. Impacted individuals, I think they need access to the resources so that they can better understand the mechanics of the act going forward. I think that agencies like the Human Rights Commission, which has done, some people will tell you they've done a mediocre job, other people will tell you they're excellent, right? Depends on the perspective and who you're asking. I think that for my audience, they need access to these materials, and the Human Rights Commission should be at the forefront of providing that access. Whether it's public campaigns, meeting people where they're at that are the most marginalized in housing units, meeting them in libraries and other training facilities around the city. I think that the Human Rights Commission needs to step out. And I also think like organizations like mine, Vocal New York, we need to be more influential in grounding out support for the Fair Chance Act and letting our own members know about their about the employer's obligations and their obligations if they feel that their rights have been violated. So really to summarize, I feel like a true ban on the box would lead to more individuals obtaining employment, long-term employment that will help them afford housing. You know, this is all in a civil rights and housing context, like I said before, that You know, if you're able to secure employment, you're able to pay for home housing. You know, some affordable, some not affordable. But if we're talking in the affordable context, with marginalized people, you're able to afford housing, which leads to less mental stress, which leads to less mental episodes, correct? You're able to secure gainful health benefits through employment, which also leads to less housing. I mean, which also leads to more housing, which also leads to a better and healthy community, right? A lot of people out there on the streets right now doing things that some will find otherwise untoward are because they can't get employment. And if you can't get employment, that leads, in my opinion, down a path of destruction that is hard to come off of. You know, so let's talk more about ban in the box. Let's talk more about its counterpart 2.0. Let's talk a little bit more about defunding and reallocating resources to the Fair Chance Act. And let me make another point. When we talk about defunding, we talk about reducing certain entities, right? We talk about reducing certain carceral aspects of the society, but we don't talk about what needs to be expanded. Like the Fair Chance Act needs to be expanded. Employment resources need to be expanded. Healthcare for all needs to be expanded. You know, educational resources need to be expanded. Once these resources are expanded, recidivism will drop down to a point that's so minuscule that the opponents of laws like the Fair Chance Act will have nothing to talk about. So thank you for the time here, and I yield back.
Thank you so much, John. Let's jump to Yonah from and I hope I'm saying this correctly. I should be at this point. The KATAL Center for Equity, Health, and Justice. And then we have a few questions for the floor that I'll come back to. I want to hear folks as a response to. But right now, let's go to Yonah. Yonah, you have the floor.
All right, thanks, Nick, and thank you for the Public Advocate for having me on this really amazing panel. And thank you, John, as well, for kind of setting the tone, because I think what I'm going to be talking about is another issue that people with criminal records, and particularly people on parole, face that connects with employment. And so I'm really going to be talking about the issue around technical violations. And in particular, because at KATAL, we've been working on a campaign to restrict the use of technical violations of parole, like missing an appointment with a parole officer or being late for a curfew, which we've seen has occurred for folks that, you know, have a late work shift or have a really early work shift and, you know, can't make the strict curfew requirements on their parole, or something as simple as like failing an alcohol test. And this deeply connects to the Fair Chance Act because there are roughly 35,000 New Yorkers on parole at any given time, and many of whom are either looking for employment or have employment, and at any given point can pick up a technical violation, and then they can be sent to Rikers Island, where they basically have to wait like 60 to 90 days to get a hearing in front of a judge. And so, you know, if you did have a job or you were in the process of finding a job, you know, you basically lose that and you have to restart all over again. And so this is just an outrageous process. And for a lot of folks, you know, it can be really demoralizing. Also, you know, just has folks have to restart again and again and again. And New York, unfortunately, leads the nation, only second to Illinois in terms of reincarcerating folks for technical violations. And so, you know, Nick mentioned that New York sometimes leads the way on a lot of issues. And unfortunately, this is one where New York is just outright and actually doing some of the worst in the country. And if we look in the city in particular, if we look at all the groups that are incarcerated on Rikers Island, the only group that's been increasing over the last several years is folks that are getting reincarcerated for these types of technical violations. And so the borough president mentioned, you know, there's lots of folks that are getting out, whether it's for pretrial stuff or for technical violations, but this is one area where folks are still going back in. And particularly folks that, you know, are coming home from upstate and, you know, are working to get housing, to get jobs, and then are getting cycled in and out of the system because of these type of non-criminal technical violations that are stuff that, you know, everyday people do, but folks on parole basically live with a different standard of justice. And at the state level, it's actually quite shocking. About a third of all new admissions to state prisons are for folks that are reincarcerated for these type of technical violations. And so it's not folks going in for new crimes or anything like that. It's folks that are basically who are on parole and basically are getting reincarcerated for stuff that you know, normal folks would not even be arrested for. And so this definitely relates a lot to kind of the larger conversations that Franck was naming and John around, you know, this issue intersects with a lot of other issues, right? And so one thing that we're really working on with the Less is More Act is to ensure that folks, that are coming home can actually stay within their communities so they can actually get, stable housing, get meaningful employment, and not run the risk of being reincarcerated for stuff like missing an appointment or being late for curfew. And so the KATAL organization, we're part of an executive team that's working on the Less is More Act. And so it's a bill that's currently in the New York legislature. And it would do a lot of things. The main thing, it would restrict the use of incarceration for technical violations. So basically judges and parole officers would not have the option of incarcerating for these types of non-criminal technical violations, and folks would actually be able to stay in the community, stay with their employment while they're on parole. And the second piece, which is actually, I think, really important to this issue about, either seeking employment or maintaining employment, is the due process piece around the act we're working on. Because currently, like I mentioned, if you get an alleged technical violation, you automatically get a warrant out for your arrest, and you just basically have to wait in jail while you're waiting for your parole hearing. And basically the new law, what it would do is folks that get an alleged violation, you would just get a desk appearance ticket, and then you would just have to show up in your hearing, but you would, maintain your job and maintain your housing and the other aspects of your life while you're, going through that process. And then the last two provisions are around making speedy trial hearings, so your hearings go much faster. And then the last provision, which I think is also super important and it relates a lot to this issue around employment, is providing earned time credits so folks can actually get off parole earlier. So then they don't have to live under community supervision, don't have to have curfews. And so that can also help folks, work a range of different jobs that, might have early shifts or late shifts, and they don't have to deal with, working with a parole officer to change their curfew hours every time they, have to change a shift. And so this work, would make it just much easier for folks to, stay within the community when they're home. And so if folks want to learn more about the Less is More Act, you can go to lessismoreny.org, and you can learn more about the campaign and the work we're doing around, stopping incarceration for technical violations. And the last thing I'll just name is that, and I think the Manhattan Borough president talked about it, but this issue was very important, prior to COVID, but it's also even more important now because we know jails and prisons are incubators of contagion. And unfortunately, the first two folks to pass away from COVID-19 on Rikers Island were there solely for these of non-criminal technical violations of parole. And so this is like, life or death for folks. And so people should not be needlessly subjected to, heightened risks of COVID-19 for these type of technical violations. And so, so we're definitely looking to get this bill passed in the 2021 legislative session. And, it would lead to over 5,000 folks across the state getting released from jails and prisons. And so it's a huge impactful kind of decarceration measure. And also, will help folks get off parole much sooner and don't have to live under hyper supervision and surveillance, and help folks, maintain their employment, their housing, all these stuff without having to live under, the carceral state. So thank you for having me.
Absolutely, thank you for that. And one thing you mentioned that I want to really focus on is the issue. I think Melissa focused on it as well, as the issue of violations, and one in particular, loitering for the purpose of prostitution. Tomorrow, November 20th, is TDOR, the Trans Day of Remembrance, and we know that unfortunately, there are just far too many trans folks losing their lives and being killed simply because of who they are. And that is, in fact, a national crisis that requires all of us to respond immediately right now, all of us as the government, working with the community. And so I'm happy that once we pass Fair Chance Act 2.0, that particular violation, first, it shouldn't be happening in the first place because you're literally targeting people simply because of who they are. But if those convictions happen to occur, and hopefully they're appealed, we're going to pass a bill that would shield that from the process, so that trans New Yorkers and others who are targeted by that provision, which gives way too much discretion to the police department to determine what you are doing based on where you're walking and who you are, that discussion shouldn't exist, and people are just being targeted. It's unacceptable. So I'm glad that we're moving on 2.0 to take a step further to protect trans New Yorkers and to protect others who are unfairly targeted by this provision. So Yonah, thank you for mentioning the issue of violations. That is a critical amendment that we're looking to move forward very soon. So thank you so much for that. So we've kind of talked about what the Fair Chance Act is, what it does. We talked about enforcement. We talked about some of the numbers and stats. I want to shift a bit to what is next. We talked about 2.0. I hope to see that that are happening. And someone earlier mentioned the issue of intersectionality. We got about 20 minutes left. I'm going to shift the conversation from a fair chance itself to the intersectionality conversation and what is next. And this will be just a quick 20-minute conversation. So I'm not going to call on folks. Just jump in and give us your thoughts, and I'll help. You know, if someone two folks are talking, I'll help moderate that piece. But anyone could jump in, Brandon or Yonah, or anyone could jump in. What is next? What else should policymakers at the city level, state level, and hopefully come the 20th of January, the federal level, really be looking at when it comes to increasing protections for people who may have a record? And anyone could jump in, and I'll come back in after that.
I'll jump in, Nick. Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I know you and the public advocate mentioned this earlier. Right now, the council is looking at a bill to address, you know, this type of discrimination in housing. The commission had the opportunity to speak at the hearing, and we are in the affirmative, and we want to make sure that we look, just as other jurisdictions have, that we are ensuring that, you know, people with an arrest or conviction record are not being discriminated against and are not housing insecure because of, you know, a mistake, right? Once again, we want to look at people because of their merit and not because of their mistakes. So I think that is one area that we need to look at. Now I'm kind of speaking outside of the commission a little bit, but I'll say this when I say this next point is New York State in of itself, you know, does not have expungement. People say, oh, like you can get your record expunged. Texas, you can get your record expunged. New York, you cannot. For some people, that may not make sense, right? In Texas, you can get your record expunged. In New York State, you cannot, right? So there are so many different issues. I mean, the commission, we're looking at what we can do here in New York City, but as you said, on the state and on the federal level, I think that we do need to start pushing the needle. And I also just want to thank Jonathan for keeping our feet to the fire, because in your remarks, there are a lot of blind spots that you mentioned that where we need to do better. We had an educational campaign, we have literature and brochures, but there are areas where we need to do better and spaces where we are not. And so I'd love to connect with you afterwards so that we can be in touch, and myself and some of my colleagues, William Whitaker, Abraham Tejeda, folks who are really leading this effort on the commission's end, we'll make sure that we're in touch with you to see how we can close those gaps as well, because that's another area where we can improve.
Thank you, Frank. And let me say, as a Vocal New York leader, first of all, anybody can reach me through my CRU director at Vocal, Nick at vocal-newyork.org. That's Nick at vocal-newyork.org. New York is NY, okay, not NEWY, okay. With that being said, I want to say this, that next steps involve tightening up legislation on a state level. And Vocal New York, we're specialists at that. We have a lot of affiliate brothers and sister organizations that are just as instrumental as we are, but you know, vocal means something besides just the moniker when we go upon Albany. I think a lot of the legislatures listen to us. So when it comes to something as important as banning the box, or something that can really decarcerate a town or a city or a state, right? Banning the box, we have to go up there and make those legislatures understand us and understand the significance of banning the box, okay? Understand the significance of providing stable income to people facing reentry. Yonah said it best, with people on parole, you know, you're locking these people up for technical violations instead of helping them secure employment. And every time I turn around, there always seems to be another job fair advertising for porters, street cleaners. Right now in my neighborhood, they're paying people to shovel snow temporarily for the season, $15 an hour, you know? But then if one of my neighbors who have come home or has been impacted by the law, they'll come and say, hey, John, you know, they didn't hire me. Well, why? What happened? You're able-bodied, you're a strong guy, what happened? And in both of our minds, we understand what happened, but it's never a spoken word, because he has never gotten to the point where a conditional job offer has been extended. So that's the problem, part and parcel, when it comes to Black, brown people and low-income people and employers that we face, right? That a lot of the time they're preempted for getting a job by the fact that they've never been issued a conditional offer of employment. Because a lot of, and the reason is that I'm just going to say one more thing about that. The reason for that is the stigmatisms, right? It's the stigma that I'm guilty of having all 3 Bs. I'm big, black, and bald, you know? So outside of getting a federal civilian job that I had, I don't know where I would have ended up, because that's the stigma that applies to someone like me, right? And not saying that taking one of them is not enough for people to discriminate, but taking all 3 definitely puts me at the back of the line. You know, so I've been fortunate, but I come from a neighborhood where I've seen it all too well. I'm with an organization where we've seen it all too well at Vocal. So I think legislature is part of the plan. Public awareness is also part of the plan. And just making as much noise as we can in webinars just like this and other mediums to get the word out there is also part of the plan. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you so much, John. Listen, Marilyn, Brandon, Melissa, Yonah, any additional comments? You can just go ahead and jump in. What's next?
Yeah, no, I was gonna definitely add on to John's point, and I think specifically now, like it's really important for us to look at, you know, how we spend money at the state and the city level in particular. And like one quick example, even around the issue of incarcerations for technical violations, New York City spends $300 million alone for incarcerating folks for these types of technical violations, and then the state government spends another $300 million incarcerating folks at the prison level. And so this is all money that could be, you know, reinvested in communities that have been impacted by this issue and that need to, you know, for jobs, for housing, for better healthcare. So yeah, that's definitely one thing that we're thinking about is like, you know, how are we, you know, taking money away from the carceral state, away from the prisons, the jails, and stuff like that, and investing it back into communities. And so, you know, finding, you know, basically common sense, you know, proposals like the Less is More Act that would definitely do that and would particularly help with that at a time when, you know, budgets are going to be tight all around. And so we should be, you know, cost saving where we can and cost saving where, you know, it doesn't, you know, impact people's lives, but actually helps them in a positive way. So that's definitely stuff that we're looking at. And then also, I think particularly for us, particularly now in the COVID-19 pandemic, you know, we want to make sure that people are not being incarcerated, not being put in jails and prisons where there's been outbreaks, you know, in different prisons in Western New York. And we saw what happened in Rikers, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic. So we also want to make sure that, you know, as we're still going through this pandemic, we're doing everything we can to make sure that people are not going back into Rikers Island and not going back into jails and prisons. And we're seeing even the numbers on Rikers starting to steadily, you know, increase again and getting well above 4,000. And so that's one thing that we're definitely working on and making sure that, you know, folks, when they're thinking about what they're going to be doing in the next session, you know, really thinking incarceration as like a centerpiece, particularly because of this COVID-19 pandemic.
Right. Thanks. Brandon, any comments or Marilyn or Melissa?
Yeah, another piece I would uplift is, you know, the opportunities to create more jobs in proven public health and public safety solutions outside of the justice system, right? So when we're talking about workforce development and ending employment discrimination, I think we also have to look at how we compensate jobs, right, that are like civil servant jobs or jobs that provide public health and public safety resources in our communities so that people are more inclined to go for those jobs when discrimination, you know, is removed or, you know, challenged to be removed from those roles. Really how we compensate those jobs at the level that we see things like law enforcement being compensated, right? So this past year, there was a huge fight over wrestling just $1 billion away from the NYPD's $6 billion budget. And that money got shifted around to basically preserve the same role of police presence in public schools. But can we think about how, when we take that money away, we invest it into mental health services, we invest it into, you know, like the peer network of New York and peer coordination programs for people who are active or former drug users. How do we compensate these roles where we predominantly do see people who are justice involved or from low income Black and brown neighborhoods? How do we invest more money and dollars into those roles, which will continue to protect us during a pandemic and beyond, and not investing so many resources into law enforcement and incarceration and the justice system?
Absolutely. Here, cheers. Agree 100%. In fact, 2 quick points about the budget and about mental health, which you just talked about. On the budget, yeah, the public advocate and our team were very clear that the so-called $1 billion cut wasn't a real cut. And as you just accurately said, you know, moving staff around from agency to agency, but still have the same carceral function when it comes to children and kids, doesn't inspire much confidence that we really get the point. And so that's why as folks who are advocates in this space, it's critical to listen to what folks are saying when they run for office. Watch what they're doing while they are in office, because quite frankly, advocates were clear. We were clear. $1 billion cut. That was the demand. And so, you know, I get the difficulty of the negotiations. I for full disclosure, worked in the administration for a while. So I get that. But the bottom line is, cut through the red tape, cut through the bureaucracy. Folks on the ground are who we are governing with, not for. So why are we not meeting the people that we are governing with where they are? You know, and earlier folks mentioned names that we should not be able to rattle off: Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Deborah Danner, Kowalski Trawick. So many Black and brown people losing their lives under suspicious circumstances, which brings me to my second point. I mentioned Deborah Danner, for example. We have a mental health system that isn't a mental health system. You know, if someone with a badge, a gun, and a dark uniform rolls up to someone's house to, quote, do a wellness check, why is it that that so-called check often turns violent and is escalated? Because if someone is experiencing a crisis, the last thing you need is for someone to appear in front of your 2 eyes and 2 ears, barking commands at you, and visibly looking like they're going to commit harm to you. So I'm proud to work in an office where we are pushing legislation to fully reform the city's mental health and crisis response system to get exactly at what Brandon is talking about, because that's a critical next step. And earlier I talked about what advocates are demanding. This is a long-standing demand which we align with, and it's up to those who are in power to help us realize that vision. And there's no real need to realize that vision more than what we've been seeing in the last, not only 6 months with George Floyd, but quite frankly, since the beginning of this country, when Black and brown folks are brought here under chattel slavery. Well, you know, we have to realize in response that we do have options to response. And so we have a city government that is not exactly where we need it to be. And that is why we need all of us in coalition to push and keep pushing. And we're not twisting in the wind. We're here talking about the Fair Chance Act 5 years ago and amending the bill and keep pushing. It's always a matter of pushing until we reach a place where all of us as humans, no matter what we look like, are respected as human beings. So Brandon, really, I thank you for that. And I just want to make sure, does anyone else have any comments on sort of what's next?
And I also want to add to what Brandon, don't forget our youth.
Yeah.
Our youth are suffering, you know, mental health, incarceration. They need funding. They need to reallocate all that money and put it right in the community, because our community is the one that suffers. And we need to put that money back into our community. There's no question there. We see it in everything, the violence, everything that's happening right now in my community. So I don't want to forget the youth, because they're very important. They're our future.
Absolutely.
You know, I'm a harm reduction advocate, so I'm about prevention. Let's get them now before they be looking for the third Fair Chance Act.
Can I add something too? Because, you know,
sure.
As we're talking about the Fair Chance Act, I'm here thinking, what are the different ways that people are criminalized, right? What are people criminalized for? And as we juxtapose that, we're using a racial justice lens, as we also spoke about, something that disproportionately impacts people of color, but particularly Black folks, is, you know, marijuana usage. And so in April 16 of 2020 of this year, actually, the Commission on Human Rights had a public hearing talking about marijuana in employment. And as of May 10th of 2020, your employer cannot test, a potential employer, so if you're applying for a job, cannot test you for marijuana usage. Why is that important? Because we know that people of color and low-income folks are more likely to be tested for marijuana usage. And so then are then criminalized for said usage, right? What are other ways people are criminalized? Because of folks' credit scores, right? People will be criminalized and punished because of the fact that they have a low credit score. But maybe a person has a low credit score because
every time they try to apply for said job or a job of that nature, they're not able to get it. So what happens? It impacts their credit because then you have to take a couple extra swipes and may not be able to pay on time, right? So we have to think about these in really nuanced ways, but in all actuality, it's not nuanced ways. It's common sense. How do we be fair and what makes sense? And so that's another thing. We could talk about the Fair Chance Act, but looking at some of these other areas, credit discrimination, testing of marijuana and employment. A potential employer cannot test you as you're applying for a job. So those are some things that we do have to talk about, and we'll see where the law goes from here, because this is where it's at now. We'll see how far it goes moving forward.
Absolutely, and I have to give our team credit that pre-employment marijuana testing ban was actually a public advocacy bill, which we also fought very hard on. So I think that proves the point that we have a public advocate's office that is focused squarely on harm reduction and making sure that folks' right to respect it. And so we're going to continue that work. And I'm glad, Frank, that you brought that up.
About that, if you don't mind, jump in there. But to Frank's point and to your point, there needs to be a public awareness campaign about that, the Marijuana Employment Act, right? A lot of people don't know the rights under that act. So Vocal's willing to get with the Public Advocate's Office and my friend Frank and his organization and all the other organizations on the panel to work towards a viable strategy to get an awareness campaign together about that. Thank you.
That sounds great. Happy to work with Vocal as always, John. I want to make sure that we have no other additional comments from Melissa, or I think Marilyn jumped in. Melissa, you have anything, or are you good?
Yeah, I just wanted to plug one more time the Fair Chance Act for housing and say, that's a public advocate bill as well. And the reason why that bill is so important and really so exciting is that it would prohibit landlords or any housing provider most housing providers from running background checks ever at any point in the process. So different from the Fair Chance Act in employment, a housing provider could not at any point discriminate against somebody because of their conviction record, regardless of the type of conviction record at any point in the process. And really what that's saying is that people should have a right to housing. Everyone should have a right to housing. Housing is a human right. So it's a really exciting bill, and I'm really glad that the Public Advocate is sponsoring it and fighting for it.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you so much. And that's us in partnership with Council Member 11, who's the prime sponsor. But you're absolutely right. We're have to get that done. All right. So if there are no questions on the Facebook thread, we're going to wrap in a couple of minutes. This has been a real riveting conversation. I think this is only part one. We're going to continue this. And my role as first deputy of public advocate, I think my responsibility is to help, to John's point, make sure that folks are aware of their rights in these various laws we're passing, so that you're aware of them, and that when you encounter a problem, you know that you can call the commission or our office to enforce those laws. And then, folks like Melissa will come in if needed to back you up as well. So let me see if there's any closing remarks from folks or any questions from Facebook. And if not, I'll come back with a closing statement. So any closing remarks or any questions?
No, I don't think so. But I would say thank you to the Public Advocate's Office for actually working with, and really, I'd say, transforming the role of the Public Advocate's Office over this past year, especially during COVID, and collaborating with communities and hosting events like these and engaging all of us. And we're looking forward to working with you all in the future.
Great. Thank you so much, Brandon. Any other closing remarks before we wrap?
Yeah, I just want to say Vocal New York extends its gratitude for enlisting us as part of the conversation. And we also want to say that we're proud that the Public Advocate's Office has exposed little known laws like the Fair Chance Act, so that, we can put it on a platform where it can be analyzed, explained, and people that are impacted be made aware of what it is and what it does and the remedies they can seek. So thank you for that from Vocal.
Absolutely. Anyone else, feel free to jump in. Okay. All right, great. This has been a really amazing hour. I want to thank all of our panelists for bringing your stories to this conversation. We will do more of them. I know an hour is very quick when you talk about human rights. It's a never-ending conversation, unfortunately. But I am always been optimistic because we know with the right coalition, we can pass these laws at the city level, state level, and federal level. And also make another final point, which is about politics, but it's also about policy. There is a new White House coming in, and without talking about preferences in terms of candidates, that's not the purpose of this conversation at all. It is though about the policy, and it's about making sure, no matter who's in power, that we speak with one voice and make clear that we're about equity, no matter who we are. So whether it's justice-involved Americans, whether it's Americans without a home, whether it's Americans who are struggling with, school reopenings, or whatever the issue is, we will speak with one voice and push toward equity. So I want to thank our entire panel for your expertise and insights. And we will continue this again. I'll lastly say you can visit our website at advocate.nyc.gov to get in touch with the Public Advocate's Office or any of the panelists. And our Twitter is the Office of the Public Advocate. Thank you all for a riveting conversation. Again, part one, we'll do this again, but we'll be back. And we thank you all for tuning in. Good night, everybody. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you, Nick.